All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I am your host, Jacob Winograd. Conversation I have for you guys tonight is a subject that I've been wrestling with for a while, and I've been wanting to talk to people about this for a while, and that's why you have a guest on the Biblical Anarchy Podcast as opposed to just this being done on the green room or just my regular solo episodes. But I think we're at a weird point in the liberty movement, at least as far as I can tell, for as long as I've been in it. And as also, I'd say, we as the church, right? We as Christians are, evaluating what's going on in our nation and the world. It's definitely a bit of I don't know, a crossroads, a tipping point. A lot of different cliche analogies we could use. But I think we have to ask hard questions about, dealing with the world as we want it, balancing that with dealing with the world as it is. And we talk a lot about this in libertarian circles, and rightly so. We talk about our principles, right? Our legal theory, our economic theories, and our commitment to those abstract principles, I think, is good and important. We believe in non-aggression. We believe in peace and freedom and prosperity, self-determination, self-ownership. And those are all good things that need to be talked about. But the question that's increasingly on my mind is, how do these ideas hold up in a society that feels increasingly fragmented, increasingly tribal, very chaotic and unstable, and just seems to hate liberty, right? And even sometimes, seems to be very anti-Christ. It even seems a lot of times people who call themselves Christians seem to hate when you quote scripture to them. And so I'm just wondering, is the liberty movement still building towards liberty, or are we watching, liberty unravel in real time? And there's this phrase that's been floating around in the political discourse that I've heard Dave Smith and a few others use. I don't know where it originates, but I think it kind of cuts to the heart of some of the convergence of a few different topics of discussion. But this idea of bomb the world, invite the world, that there's a bomb the world, invite the world agenda. It's a provocative way of describing this sort of dual role that America is playing, where we're waging endless wars abroad while opening up borders at home, or at least somewhat opening them up, or failing to, close them. I'm not trying to oversimplify it, but there's an immigration crisis, right? Like, as much as we don't have open borders, we do have, large influx of illegal immigrants nonetheless. And these things seem to be connected, right? Insofar as the endless wars cause destabilization, as well as the intelligence agencies play a role in this. And for those who oppose empire, such as us libertarians and Christians who believe in peace and voluntary association, I think we have to ask: are we, when we're talking about the topic of immigration, is it just that topic by itself, or is this really just kind of like one outward manifestation of a deeper, multifaceted problem? A framework that's going to be part of what we talk about tonight is an article that's actually, I think, the transcript of a speech that Jeff Deist from the Mises Institute gave years ago, back in 2017, I think before I was even a libertarian at this point. But he said that many people in the West still care about blood and soil and family and their nations. And not just because they're racists, but because identity, family, and just where people live, that these things matter to people. And he said that if libertarians ignore this reality, we're doing that at our own peril. That we're making the movement too theoretical and too detached from real world issues and sort of like what people are concerned about. So my last live stream in the green room was with Jim Babka, and we touched on this a little bit, but I thought that a good person to help me work some of this out, because I've been, kind of going back and forth with how I view a lot of these topics for a while, is Cody Cook, which everyone should know from the Libertarian Christian Institute, and also has his own project called Cantus Firmus. He's the author of the Anarchist Anabaptist, and I know he has also like a little, I think, Anabaptist handbook, and has written all sorts of stuff. Is also a co-host on the Libertarian Christians podcast. But we're going to explore all this. If the liberty movement can survive this growing tribalism, if we can have open borders and a functioning republic, can we, do we have to return to more localized nations and something quasi self-governant before we can dream of voluntarism? And then what does our faith say about all this? So that's the stage for this conversation, and I'm going to bring Cody up now so we can dive into it. Cody, thank you for being here with me tonight. We're recording this at night, as we often do. But yeah, it's good to see you, my friend. You are like the I don't know, what's the term for, I guess, like, you're the quarterly guest of the Biblical Anarchy podcast now.
I think that would be the quarterly guest of the Biblical Anarchy podcast, I think is what you'd call that.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
So
a perennial.
Perennial. I was looking for. Yes, that's what I was looking for. The like what ends in like the perennial. Yeah, that's the right word.
Maybe not a favorite, but a perennial something. Perennial guest.
Yes. So yeah. So Cody, I gave a long intro monologue there, and it's one of these things where it's hard to, I think, really pin down, like, here's the, like, I think a lot of episodes we do will be like, we're talking about the Constitution, or we're talking about economics, or we're talking about the war in Israel or Ukraine. This is something where it's like a lot is happening all at once, and it's hard to say like what the theme is. But do you at least, and I'm sure we're going to have a lot of stuff here we agree on, a lot of stuff where I hope we disagree enough, at least, that it'll make for good dialogue. But do you agree with me that this is somewhat of the central themes and tensions and problems that we as a society, and also the liberty movement, is kind of having to figure out right now, especially post-Trump 2.0?
Yeah. I was thinking about, like you mentioned, like, what's the organizing idea here? If I were to maybe suggest the title, it might be something like, how big is libertarianism? Because when I think about what these kind of debates are about, I think it's largely about, it's not just about evangelism. I think it's more about, like, because I understand sort of saying, like, well, if we are speaking to people on the right, we emphasize this part of what we believe. If we speak to people on the left, we emphasize this part of what we believe, and then we try to kind of bring them in and expand it. And to me, I think what I've been seeing is more kind of a conversation about, I think, redefining libertarianism along the kind of culture war concerns and identity politics. And so questions about immigration, questions about racism, nationalism, are sort of coming into this conversation, because it's like, on the one hand, as libertarians, it seems like individualism and sort of a fundamental equality, although I know that we would, a word like egalitarianism can be read in different ways, and some libertarians just don't like the word. But like, that tends to suggest a kind of neutrality about things like race and ethnicity and nationality and stuff like that. But there are some who I think want to emphasize another part of libertarianism, which is kind of the live and let live side. And so then it sort of becomes, well, do we really have to have an opinion on a subject like that? Isn't it okay for, if a bunch of racists want to start a community or whatever, to let them do it, right? And isn't that compatible with libertarianism? And so, I think we're kind of having this conversation largely about, I think it's kind of the paleo thing again. It's like, can we make room for people on the right who are maybe a little bit disaffected, who maybe see that the system is bad like we do, and maybe they think it's bad for different reasons, but there's maybe a little bit of overlap there, and we can sort of bring them in, and but also make them feel like they have a safe place to land, that this is not, some kind of weird cosmopolitan internationalist, kind of thing. And so I think that's kind of really what this debate is about, is do libertarians need to, take a strong position on, like, open borders or being against racism? I almost said anti-racism, but that's another one of those words that means different things to different people. or is it can we let a million flowers bloom? And is, is it more libertarian to let a million flowers bloom, or is it more libertarian to say, as libertarians, we believe in the individual dignity and and value of each human being? And so I think that's to me, I think that's maybe what the larger part of this conversation is. And I won't repeat myself or pontificate more about that. Maybe we can go from there, but that's what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I certainly I'm of two minds of this because on one hand, I've generally, I guess, been more in the what people would call paleo libertarian camp, but that even for me wasn't something about like, well, I want to recruit racists and tell them it's okay to be racist. It's more just like, uh, things like racism, things like prejudices. These things exist on a somewhat of a spectrum, and then there's things that are related to it, like immigration policies, protectionism, nationalism, and I think I've always kind of had, I guess, two tracks in my sort of libertarian ANCAP biblical anarchy message, which is that I want to have one foot firmly entrenched in the foundational principles because I do think they're important, and um, I think no matter how you're going to act in the world, you need to have that north star to guide you. Um, but I also felt like, but the north star should guide you. Like you shouldn't just be like, you know, sitting in one place, gazing up at the north star, going, "Man, it's such a good navigator." But I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna follow it. I'm not gonna use it to help me get to where I want to go. And it's like, so I do want to see a society that is not just more, obviously as a Christian, I want to evangelize, want more people to come to saving faith. I also want to see a society where there's more peace, more human flourishing, more social cooperation, less violence, less aggression, and you know, how do we get there is the question, and it does seem like we and I guess this would be my question to you. Do you feel like this is how I feel, is that no one has a good answer to this? It feels like one side says, well, it's about education, it's about being committed to our principles, which like I agree that's like an important step one, but the step two is sort of like, well, we don't really have a step two. It's just that'll eventually, get us there. Then there's a lot of people who have a step two, but their step twos are kind of like, we're seeing that play out, and it has mixed results, right? I think before the Mises Caucus, there was like, well, the step two is we're going to really appeal to the coastal elites and sort of this like sort of liberal progressive establishment, and go hard on the social issues and whatnot, and almost try to trick them into being uh, you know libertarians, and that didn't pan out, and now it seems like we've kind of, I guess, for better or worse, had a experiment the other direction that's almost like a, not exactly the paleo strategy 2.0, but you could call it that. And I would say that a year ago, heck, even was it, we're in May right now, so like 5 months ago, even 2 months ago, I was like still like various degrees of optimistic about how that could go. But now I've seen that play out more, and I'm starting to be like, I don't know that this tree is producing good fruit, because it feels like, to put it the way you put it, can we get these people to come to us and feel like this is a safe landing spot? Kind of feel like the opposite is happening, and there are libertarians who are finding like, yeah, maybe the liberty movement is not, the best landing spot for me, and maybe I need to, just smuggle in a little bit of statism and tribalism and stuff,
Yeah.
and that's
Well,
the path forward.
yeah, yeah. When I think that the question I think becomes what's at the center of libertarianism, and for me, well, maybe there's some documents here we should bring up in a minute, things that we've been kind of debating about, because you used the word optimism earlier for yourself, and some of our kind of private debates have been about, um, I think, you being more optimistic about kind of this sort of appeal to the populist right, and maybe what Trump could bring in, and you're like, these people aren't all just racists and anti-Semites, and I've been like, yeah, they are, and so and and now you're like, okay, maybe more of them more than I thought.
Right.
And so To me, when you talk about strategy, it seems like there, we'll mention, I'm sure, Rothbard and Jeff Deist and some of these folks, but like Deist kind of argues that libertarianism, really the center of libertarianism is decentralization. And I would say
Right.
it's not. I mean, it's compatible with it, but it's not the same thing. And Rothbard sort of argues that the center of libertarianism is privatization. And I'm like, well, no, it's not really the center, but it's also compatible with it. For me, it's kind of like what you said earlier. It's about the freedom for individuals to live in a voluntary society that respects their rights as individuals. It's about peace. It's about working together. It's about cooperation.
Right.
And so if I think that's really what we're trying to get to. And what some would sort of say is, well, if we start with decentralization, we'll probably get there. Or if we start with privatization, we'll probably get there, right? Like David Friedman, the son of Milton Friedman, who's an anarchist. I watched a video of his recently where he was sort of saying, like, yeah, let's just start with privatization and it will probably make a more libertarian society. It might not, but it probably will. And say, well, that's not good enough for me because that's not really what the center of it is for me. Privatization is great, but it's not the center of it. And so if you have a solution that doesn't really get us there, I don't really see that as a solution, And so
Hmm.
anyway, maybe we can talk a little bit about these kind of different approaches, but to me, I think that's part of the problem, and we'll get into why I
Yeah.
don't think
So
decentralization is the right solution.
I would agree with you that decentralization is not the heart of libertarianism. I think decentralization is a feature of a libertarian society. I think it's a good strategy in terms of like trying to decentralize is generally better than I guess the opposite. Like, it's generally not good to centralize, but I've even said like, to play I hate using the term devil's advocate, to play angel's advocate. I don't know. But to play an advocate for a contrary position, you could say that there are times in history where centralizing power, although it had its trade-offs, good things did come about it. Like as much as I am sympathetic to, I guess like the more paleo libertarian wing, having very and even just the regular libertarian wing, I think having legitimate criticisms for Abraham Lincoln and sort of the centralization of power and suspension of certain constitutional norms during the Civil War, and also just being anti-war and not wanting a war in the first place, right? And there's a lot of centralization and authoritarianism that happened, but it would also be, I think, like overly reductionist to say like nothing good happened out of that mess, right? Like there was some in terms of like the progress of society, broadly speaking, in terms of how we view minorities, how we view different races, how we view slavery. Like that was like the worst possible way to take a step forward, but it was for all of the bad. I think there was a step forward to be analyzed there. And I'm sure you might articulate it differently, but I think you would mostly agree with that kind of couching of it. But we would much prefer if we could have like had the good stuff without all the bad, right? Like generally we want to pursue the the moral progress through decentralization. Uh you have something to say. You can chime in quick before I get to my next bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, with decentralization, I think that there's an assumption that decentralization is a step closer to individualism, right? So if you have this kind of big centralized power, and now we say, okay, well, we're still centralized, but it's on a smaller scale. Well, that's an improvement, right? We're getting closer to the sovereign individual, right? And so, Jeff Deist, the Mises Institute, in his article for A New Libertarian, which you beat me to, he argues that libertarians expect basically that our universal principles must work out through a universal political arrangement. He says that that's kind of a problem with libertarianism, that of a certain kind of libertarianism,
Sure. Yeah.
and that libertarians sort of feel like no matter where you go in the world, if it's a libertarian world, it'll look pretty much the same. Women will have equal rights to men, black and white people will be treated the same, etc. And Deist argues really that libertarians shouldn't actually want a world that looks that way, or shouldn't try for a world that looks that way. And here again, I have an agreement and a criticism. Like I agree that cultures and societies and subcultures will look different, but if we're talking about a truly libertarian society, it's not going to kill gay people just for being gay, right? You know what I mean? I don't think, yes, we've created a Sharia law, but look how much smaller it is. Like, that's libertarian, right? And so, like, decentralization is good, but it's not the same thing as libertarianism. If we got rid of
Sure.
Washington, D.C., and then half of America became significantly less free as a result of it, I wouldn't cheer that on, right? Well, it's authoritarianism, but it's at a lower level, right?
Right.
And
Just
so,
like,
like,
just to use my example as a piggyback, like if we were to say that like the North lost the Civil War and it was like cool, so there was a successful secession and a breaking up of a
right,
country, and it's like we could say, all right, but that other country is still like practicing slavery, so like we're
right,
not big fans of
yeah,
that.
look, North Korea seceded from South Korea. Isn't
Right.
that a
Yeah.
more libertarian
Yeah.
solution? And yeah,
Right.
and so, the thing about libertarians are, we tend to be in that third way space, right? So we look at the Civil War and we say you had Southerners who wanted to enslave people, or at least a proportion of the Southerners did, and then the power structure did, and then you had the North that basically said, you don't have a right to secede, you don't have a right of individualism, and so we look at them both and we say these are both bad. These are both, like, rotten fruit that emerges from a tree of authoritarianism. And so, whereas, people who are kind of on the far right or the left would look at it differently. They'd say, well, Lincoln was right because he wanted to free the slaves, or the South was right because,
Right.
they wanted to do what they wanted to do, and, who cares? Black people aren't people anyway, whatever. And so, and another example, I mean, I recently had John Wrench from the Institute for Justice on the Libertarian Christian podcast to talk about the 14th Amendment. And one thing we talked about a little bit, you look back at that history, and you see state and local governments arguing for the right of the collective to lynch Black individuals without a trial. And you have a federal government saying, no, that's not acceptable. And so then the question is, well, which one of those was more libertarian, the federal government or the subsidiaries that didn't believe in individual rights or trial rights, or due process rights? And I think that's the sort of the tension is, if if you look at if you say that all libertarianism is decentralization, you're going to say, well, obviously the localities that were lynching people were more libertarian because they were disobeying the centralized authority. But I think what I would say is, ideally we want a society that's not centralized, but also a society that respects individual rights. And in this example, just like the North and South Korea example, or the Civil War example, it just doesn't work the way that I think the decentralizers want to say that it does. It's more complicated than that. Not that they don't have any insights, but I think by centering that as libertarianism, I think they're missing the bigger picture.
Yeah, I would agree. I think decentralization is like one of those things that's like it's generally preferable, but I agree it is more it is one factor, and you can have a local tyranny that is worse than what the federal government is doing, right? Like Jim Crow was kind of an example of this, right? The civil rights movement was, and another example of this, right? So I say that reluctantly because I've often struggled with this because I'm you know so I did that thing where like you take all the red pills at once when I became a libertarian. I didn't really have my minarchist phase. I just went full blown just like ANCAP, hate the state, and I was like, and I don't and also like of course I read Spooner and all that, and I was like, the Constitution's dumb, federalism is bad, just like all this. And as I've matured a bit in my libertarianism, I still have like those core critiques of those things, but I understand how like it's not all black and white. Like sometimes those things uh, can be good, can be useful, can produce good outcomes, even though I as you say, like they are still kind of a rotten tree at the end of the day. But like you can say this tree is less rotten than other ones. But that's a good segue to one of my concerns because like on one hand, I agree with you that a criticism of what Deist is partly saying insofar as he's championing decentralization. Yeah, I agree. Like there's something missing there, but something I agree with him, and it's not that I agree with him and I'm like yay about it, right? I agree with him because I kind of see it playing out, and it's like I am on one hand, despite the sort of the joke about me being the bordertarian of the group, even though I'm not. I'm really the fence sitter of the group. I'm like the illegal immigrant that like gets up on the Trump wall, and then like I can't decide if Mexico or U.S. looks worse. And that's how I am with the border dispute. Actually, I met up with a friend for lunch today, and I told him, um, he's more on the closed border side, and I was like, listen, the issue is, I'm basically just a mirror. If I sit down with an open borders libertarian, I'm going to argue with them. If I sit down with a closed border libertarian, I'm going to argue with them. So, it is what it is. But lately, on like X, for example, I've been mostly arguing on not even just the open borders side, just arguing on we shouldn't lean into the worst parts of nationalism and tribalism and just embrace full blown ethno nationalism, which I felt like 2 years ago I would never have to be like raging on social media about this with a bunch of people, and I have to, and it's been rather disconcerting to me. And on one hand, that's like me keeping my foot in the principles, because at the end of the day, no matter what the world does, I'm not going to I'm not going to defend or adopt that kind of identity politics that takes these different forms. On the other hand, I'm recognizing that like this is a legitimate hurdle that we as libertarians have to deal with, and when it comes to our pragmatic concerns of how do we approach the equation of trying to create a more free society, it does seem like perhaps there are parts about the sort of like American experiment and this sort of like attempt to be a melting pot that's not working out because people are just too different. And at the end of the day, as much as I will waste too much time on social media arguing with people, it doesn't actually like change their minds. And like I can be as right as I can be, but sometimes people are more motivated by and it's irrational, but it's still what they're motivated by. They're motivated by their tribalism, by their fear of the unknown. It's a very human thing. It's something we see in the Bible, even. And I don't know that it's so like. What I'm not saying is that we as libertarians should do what some libertarians have done and just go like, fine, we're going to embrace it. But I also don't know that it's a problem of like I think some people are it's like that analogy, like you attract more bees with vinegar than honey, and like the problem is like I don't know that either in this case is working. Like honey is sort of like adopting the bad ideas, but the vinegar is like, well, then we're just like we're isolating ourselves and we're not making any progress. But it's anyway, all that to say, I find myself very concerned by it because on one hand I've generally been on the pro decentralization uh, bandwagon. But now that bandwagon is being hijacked by people who are saying, that it would be good to, send black people back to Africa, and saying that it would be good to, um, well, who basically hate Israel, but they hate Israel because Israel does the thing that they want to do, which is create a giant exclusivist ethno state. It's troubling. And I'm kind of at the first times for the first time since I've became a libertarian, really at a loss for like I I I really don't know what to do with this. It seems like a giant mess, and society is definitely worse. Either things have gotten worse, or it was worse than I realized, or combination of both.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about the melting pot and whether that's succeeding, I mean, it seems to me that it actually kind of works where it actually exists. It mostly seems scary to people who live in monocultural communities, right? So, like, but most people who live in New York City like living in New York City. They like that it's a melting pot. It works for them. It's like people who live in like Arkansas and like in a pretty pretty uniform community that get freaked out about the idea of drag queen story hour in Portland. And there is, I think, that's part of it. I think the other part of it is, I think violence, the state always makes things worse, because then it's not, I'm going to live how I want to live, you live how you want to live, we mind our business, and whatever. um it becomes, I think the world should be this way, and I'm going to force it to be this way, whether you like it or not. And so I think when you remove violence from the equation, that also, I think, makes the melting pot less scary. Hopefully, is that Visine there? You put in your eyes, you right?
Yeah, let's put eye drops in. Sorry.
Okay. I was like, he just lost his mind and started putting super glue in his eyes. Um, so yeah,
I'm
you
tired.
know,
I'm tired. I'm so tired of looking at social media. I'm gluing my eyes shut in protest.
I thought it was that you know, maybe the libertarians are just Republicans who smoke pot, and you just needed to. All right. Well, the quote from Deist, it's in his article for a New Libertarian that you've cited to me a few times on this, is he says blood and soil, and then he adds also God and nation, but we'll focus on the blood and soil part, still matter to people, and that libertarians ignore this at the risk of irrelevance. And he kind of expands on that. He talks about how, you know, libertarians have this tendency to fall into utopianism, and they sort of he sort of criticizes libertarians of almost talking like progressives, right? That, like, you know, we need to evolve, and then, you know, once we see things the right way, we'll bring about this new age. You know, once we all become Rothbardians or whatever, once we all accept the non-aggression principle and we all become libertarians, then the world will change. And part of that is giving up our, you know, these outdated ethnic nationalist cultural alliances, and we become hyper individualists. And so part of, you know, Dice's argument is like, well, you know, that's not going to work. That's you know, let's just start with decentralization, because that's something that's more pragmatic, right? And we can almost sort of tap into people's um you know, irrationality and tribalism
Well, I
to
think
make a more libertarian
to
world.
if I was gonna like steelman that position,
Yeah.
it would be that forced association and integration doesn't seem to be the path forward, and that like what my always said is that if you allow people to freely associate, then the free market, because it relies on free trade and voluntary association, I think that that would actually do better towards then creating more social cooperation and then eventual like softening of those lines in society. But that the state, as you said, is bad at everything it does, and because it's the threat of force, it distorts these things. And so uh, I think there's better, but I think you know that that doesn't work as well when the people setting out to do to do the decentralization are doing it motivated by protecting
Well,
their ethnic you know
yeah.
protectionism.
So, I mean, the thing is, though, I don't think that, at least as I read this article, I didn't think that Dice is really saying that if we start with decentralization, eventually everybody will get along. I think he sort of acknowledges that, he argues that tribalism is kind of a feature of human nature, and that probably it will remain a feature of human nature, and
Well,
that you'll
to a
have these
point,
kind of different sorts of
right? Because
communities that,
I think he says both, right? Because he says that, like, at the beginning that, like, our values or he does cite, like, our one of our values is that is social cooperate. We're the people of peace, of social cooperation, of free market, so things like that. Um, and I and sure, those are things that we want and shouldn't abandon, but also we have this problem of, like, that, like, people don't seem necessarily geared towards that. So, I think he's kinda like I've often said, like, do we make the perfect the enemy of the good, or do we like here's something I'm concerned about, which I don't mean to keep cutting you off, but I wanna get your thoughts on the things I'm specifically concerned about, which is that sometimes I almost feel like we as libertarians can sound almost like the communists, where we have to remake man, right? Like man has to be fundamentally different, and then our system will work. And I'm like, you know, listen, we should oppose, and I know you've seen it, like I oppose, you know, pretty vehemently, you know, anti-Semitism and racism and this sort of rise in tribalism. Um, you know, and I think you kind of do have to have. I think you do need to push back hard against its most destructive and you know, sort of pathological expressions. But then it's like below that, there is sort of this like baseline in group preference that I don't know you can, uh, you know, sort of work out of people, or that you necessarily should be the aim. The aim should, like, I would say, peaceful decentralization would be uh, the path forward. But anyway, that and maybe I'm giving Dice a charitable reading, but I think that's kind of his point, is that like we're not going to be able to of the paths we have available to us, decentralization seems to be the best bet, which I kind of still lean towards agreeing with that. But I do think it kind of depends on like the devil's on the details of how you're decentralizing.
yeah. So, I mean, so Dice sort of talks about how, you know, average people don't trust, you know, Washington D.C. and Brussels and these kind of centralized power structures. and that he argues that we should seize on that. And he says, it's not really our goal to convince other people to become Rothbardians. And he says, well, actually, I'll quote him exactly here. Is it our goal to convince them all to become thorough Rothbardians? Should libertarians care about gay marriage in Saudi Arabia or insist on the same border arrangements for Brownsville, Texas, and Monaco? Should we agitate for Texas-style open carry laws in France to prevent the next Bataclan? And so what he ultimately is kind of arguing here. Actually, I'll go on. I'll keep quoting him. Or would our time be better spent making the case for political decentralization, secession, and subsidiarity? In other words, should we let Malta be Maltese? And so that's an end quote there. And so he talks about kind of rejecting a kind of a universalistic libertarianism that says we're going to sort of center the non-aggression principle. And he says what we really should be focusing on is decentralization. And so if Saudi Arabia doesn't want to give gay people rights, well, that's Saudi Arabia's business. Now Rothbard, I think, gets a little bit closer to what you're saying. When Rothbard talks about nationalism, he sort of imagines that he sort of sees the state propping up nationalism as it currently exists. And he argues that, if you get rid of the state, you're probably going to have a lot of little sort of nations, right? Little communities where they sort of have something that they agree on, kind of a unified culture, unified political viewpoint. And so then that's still kind of tribalism, but it's on a much smaller scale. And that gets us closer maybe to individualism. And so, when I look at, like what Deist is arguing, I think part of what he's saying is that libertarianism should be paired with like Thomas Sowell's constrained vision of humanity, right? So Thomas Sowell argues that the left and the right have these two different visions, that the right sees human beings as fallible and irrational and sort of immoral, at least to a point. And so we can't expect utopia with human beings. Whereas the left has an unconstrained vision of humanity that basically means that they can be not just optimists but really utopians. And so Deist rejects that. He says, well, yeah, like you said, that's kind of a Marxist viewpoint. We can't make everybody perfect. And so, we have to
I would
take
say that's a
people
Christian viewpoint too, right? Like we as Christians don't think that, especially on this side of the second coming, that, we're ever going to have a society where people aren't under the influence of some kind of, depravity, whether you believe that's total or half
well,
total.
the Reformed believe it more than others, but it's certainly the idea of human fallibility and human sin and corruption
Right.
is there, right? And I think I largely agree with him on some of those points, at least on the constrained vision stuff. But I do think that you need some significant buy-in if you really want to create something like a libertarian society. So even to just get to decentralization, that requires a significant change in the way people are currently thinking. And
Yeah.
so, and I think people do have to change somewhat, but we can't expect them to be perfect. But I think there is sort of a buy-in into libertarianism that has to happen. And so, libertarians, I think, well, like, so here, I might kind of point to the Christian nationalist stuff, because the argument he's making here is not that different from like what Stephen Wolfe would say, right? So he says, people are emotionally tethered to the land they grew up in, ergo nationalism. But I feel like that's saying you love your wife, ergo you should love every woman with your wife's skin color. And to me, like, you can't get nationalism, which really requires a state to be stable, from the fact that you get a warm, fuzzy feeling when you get home from a vacation, right? So what I've sort of argued before is, guys like Stephen Wolfe are starting with an observation that's really kind of more of a localistic assumption, and not even that, because you can have attachments to different places. You might say, I spent the summer in Oregon with my grandparents, and that place is also special to me, right? Or in another
Oh yeah.
country even.
I have an attachment to Baltimore, not because I grew up there, but because my dad grew up there, and like the sports teams I always rooted for were from there. And I have I even it's like a love-hate thing. Like, it's become a really dangerous and kind of crappy place to live, but I have this kind of fondness and affection for it, even though I don't actually live there. I don't have that much in common with the people that live there, other than I, root for the same sports teams generally.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and so, but it's more complex than that, right? And so
Right.
for someone like Stephen Wolf, there's a bit of a disingenuousness there in saying, like, because you have a warm fuzzy feeling about a place you have a close association with or something, that means we should keep Mexicans out. Like
Well,
I don't really.
and also like it's also self-defeating. The way I've always said it is that if people have these natural like preferences, then they'll just organize based on those preferences. You wouldn't need violence to, like, if it's natural, it doesn't need violence. If it's violence, if you need violence to make it happen, then it's not natural. You can't really have it both ways. Like, it's natural and we need violence to make it happen. Like that doesn't
Yeah.
really hold up to much
Well, yeah,
logical scrutiny.
well, and it's like, what is it to be an American, right? I mean, this is an enormous land, and it's very diverse. And prior to quick travel, interstate travel and stuff like that, like you probably wouldn't go very far from where you were born, right? And so, like, we call the construction worker in Alabama and the movie star in Los Angeles Americans. We say they have the same culture and values. Like, do they? I mean, do I have more in common with an atheist Marxist in Oregon than I do with a Christian libertarian in Canada? Um, and so, it's identity is more complicated than to sort of say, you like your house, therefore let's be nationalists. And so, so there's another article that we've discussed a little bit that you had mentioned to me, Nations by Consent, by the kind of later Murray Rothbard. I think that was in, is that 92 maybe, or late 80s, early 90s,
Yeah.
94. And
It was like the last thing he wrote, I think. Like one of the
yeah,
last
well,
things
it feels kind of like later paleo Rothbard than like kind of earlier Rothbard did. But like, yes, I mean, you read Anatomy of the State, and he talks about how, like, in the Middle Ages, you'd have people living and loving and trading across borders. That they were, and even two countries that might have been at war with each other. He said nobody cared what their kings were doing; they didn't feel any loyalty to their kings, right? And so, what they sort of said was, if you lived in a border town, the people who are closest to you were not necessarily your countrymen, right? And so you would have a connection with them because you worked with them, because you lived with them or whatever. And so you didn't really care what your kings thought about that. And there's a little piece of that, I think, still in Nations by Consent. Rothbard writes, I got a quote here. It is absurd to designate every nation state with its self-proclaimed boundary as it exists at any one time as somehow right and sacrosanct, each with its territorial integrity to remain as spotless and unbreached as your or my bodily person or private property. Now that sounds great. I love that. That's peak, libertarian kind of anti-nationalism, right? And so, what he's essentially saying is that the lines that constituted a nation 50 years ago might not constitute it today. And it's really because of two fundamental realities. One is something he'd mentioned earlier, which is people ignore imaginary lines if they can, if it's more convenient for them to. They don't really care about that stuff. And the second thing is that states really expand and contract as fortunes change, and that's due to violence and so on and so forth. And so that's why I would argue, that a sort of cosmopolitan viewpoint is more consistent with libertarianism than kind of a populist or nationalistic one. And
Well, I
so
think, and
anyway,
I think I've said this to you before in our private chats. I tend to agree, so again, I'm kind of two minds because I actually would prefer the more cosmopolitan um, approach to things. But I think the problem is like your mileage varies based upon where you live. Like where I live is actually kind of like it's kind of a weird amalgamation because there's parts of where I live that are very like, I mean, the most diehard of diehard, MAGA types, and then there's also a bunch of people with the rainbow flags out there, and it's caused actually a lot of tension, where I live, right? Because you have these kind of like, it's people who've lived here for a long time, people who are moving here from Maryland and other cities, and that creates a lot of chaos, and it's not, it's the ugly side of an attempt at something like pluralism or cosmopolitanism, right? And it's like it doesn't change the underlying theory, right? Which I think that's part of what some people are getting wrong, and like they notice in real time where there's a breakdown in people's ability to tolerate different lifestyles and cultures and to get along with them, to want to live alongside them. And so that can lead you to the conclusion of like, well, then what is right is that everyone should live as separated and itemized as possible in their own little tribes. And I don't think that is like, again, I don't think that is maybe an impulse and a temptation that exists within human nature, but I don't think it is like moral or like the normative thing that we should play into. But I do think we should be wary of it, that there's good and bad ways to push against that, I guess is my point. And I do
Yeah.
wonder, like, and this is to tie it into the immigration stuff. I do wonder, like, is whatever the path forward is, if we're trying to create a freer society, like, does that step one, I've asked this, I think, for a while now, does that step one have to be that America becomes a uh, a republic again, as limited as possible, and that might mean like perhaps at this point in history, just the way things are pushing, and we might need to have some pushback, right, to kind of course correct it, but we might still end up at this moment in history where, for better or worse, and I think there are things that are better about this, right? We become more isolationist, where we bring troops home, we're not as involved in the world, but not all that's motivating that is just like a we hate war and we're pro peace. Some of it is, sort of uh, a sort of tribalism. But I don't know. Like I don't know, and this gets into stuff that we don't have the time. It isn't completely germane, the actual immigration debate and stuff like that. But those are things that I think. And coincidentally, I think in a couple weeks, Doug and I are going to go watch the debate between Dave Smith and Alex. I can't pronounce his last name. Norwa something.
Sounds like an immigrant if you can't pronounce his last name. I wonder what
Right,
position
exactly.
he's going to take.
But he works for Cato. So you can. I don't know how many Alexes work at
Yeah,
Cato, but they're going to have.
I know who you're talking about, but I can't remember his last name either. But
Yeah,
I know you're
but they're going to have a debate over this, and it's one of those things where again, I think this is an incredibly complex problem in terms of like we don't want to confuse libertarianism with uh ethno-nationalism and like tell ethno-nationalists that like we're happy for them to continue being ethno-nationalists. I don't do that, right? Like I don't mince words with them and or anything like that. But I also don't know that then uh the solution is to say not only can you not be an ethno-nationalist, but like you know you have no choice but to accept my position that like the only morally correct position we can have right now is to have complete open borders, and you can't have any qualms about that to some extent. And maybe I could be wrong on this, I could be persuaded against this. I think to some extent this is a tiny blowback, not that it's all from this, but that to the extent that the elites and whatnot have overtly and covertly pushed a system of this sort of like what I said at the beginning in the intro, this sort of bomb the world, invite the world agenda. I think what we're witnessing is somewhat of a blowback to that. And it's not that I even agree. Like, listen, just like I can say, October 7th was blowback for Israel's treatment of Gaza. I don't agree with what Hamas did October 7th, right? Russia invading Ukraine in 2022, 21. I forget the date. It's been a while. But that invasion was blowback for NATO and American and Ukrainian policy going back decades. I don't agree with Russia invading Ukraine. It was wrong. It's kind of the same thing here. Like this is, people have agency, but it's also, it's always nature and nurture, and people are somewhat going to uh, act out their incentives and what's going around them. And I think we do see some blowback where people are kind of uh tired of this, and they kind of see it as we need to just like retreat back in, become a nation again, just a small republic that governs ourselves and cares about ourselves, and we're not going to go around the world and dominate, but we're not going to just let everyone else come here at the same time, and like we just need to focus on ourselves. So
Yeah.
that's for better or worse where we're at, and I kind of feel like both sides of the movement right now are reacting to that in ways that I'm kind of like not able to get on board with.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if people who have a sort of an anti-immigration posture, that's largely because of the way the state has done it. Like you brought up a term earlier, like forced what's the word I'm looking. What was the term? The
Integration,
forced
forced
integration. There's another term
association and
too.
integration.
Yeah, well, there's forced integration. But there's another term too, where it's like people have to kind of consent to interact with each other, but it's like a forced anyway. Um, and that's kind of one of those. I feel like sort of a slippery word, right? Because like if what you're saying is, hey, if you're a Christian baker, you have to bake a cake for gay people. That's this kind of forced interaction that really nobody wants. you know, um, and so
You
like I
hate
get
me.
that.
Make a cake for me.
Right, exactly. Um, but what some people mean by that is like I don't want to have to cross the street and see a Mexican on the other sidewalk, and like like that's if that's what you mean by forced integration, that you might
uh,
have to look at somebody
I
you
always
don't
ask.
like if you're in public.
It's like you ever get Mexican food from a white person? It usually sucks.
100% it does, yeah. Um, and so yeah, Velveeta cheese instead of nacho cheese. And so, but like, so I'm not sure if the anti-immigration sentiment is really based in largely what the state has done.
Really?
And
Oh.
so the reason I say that, like people talk about kind of like, oh, well, they get welfare. And it's like, well, not generally. Like there's certain things that they can sort of get and certain they take advantage of certain, programs or whatever. But if you're not really a citizen, you don't have access to the same benefits, right? But people sort of think that that happens, right? Because they kind of want to believe it. And so
Well,
like,
yeah.
and so then like, the immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, not very far from where I'm at, right? It's a large, was it Haitians, largely Haitians who were coming in.
Yeah.
And that was kind of a government funded thing. And it's was kind of dumb in the sense that they brought over a lot of people and put them in one place. Right. And so like, it was harder for them to sort of integrate into society. So like, you can kind of say like, okay, well, that was a dumb government thing. But largely what people that I know from Springfield and people who've talked to people in Springfield, the people who are kind of there already, like one of the things they'll complain about is like, well, a lot of them are driving without driver's licenses, and that's not great. um, but like, apart from that, like there's not the hostility that you would think was there based on what Trump going out in the debate stage and saying they're eating the dogs, they're eating the
Yeah.
cats.
Yeah.
That's not really the way people in Springfield felt about it.
But
Largely.
I do wonder though, like for every example of that, and this is tough because like I'm not there. I haven't been there, right? As the saying goes. But you do hear stories about stuff in Europe with the massive influx of Muslim immigrants, and this is this tough thing where like I don't want to make the the ethno-nationalist point for them because they have this very like deterministic view of race and culture and whatnot, which I think is unscientific, unchristian, and hateful and bigoted. But I also think it'd be naive to say that people from different countries and cultures that often I think it's more just a like it's a correlation, right? Their skin color and race happen to be different, but it's not like baked into their genetics that they have this culture or this mindset. But like it's just they will have different values. And so I think that the issue for a lot of people is that they see the state inviting people in and then saying we're all part of this democratic system, but then that's going to create this kind of like moral political hazard where we don't all have the same values. And I do think that is one of the more at least legitimate concerns about the borders program is like if we bring so many people here from different places that have different values than us, and I know that you can't just come here and automatically vote, but there is such things as voter fraud and people having children here, and then those children become citizens, and then they vote, and so it's not as like there's a cartoonish version of this argument that I think is kind of silly, but I think there is a legitimate concern there that it maybe doesn't happen as instantaneously as some people make it out to be, but it does create some concerns about, like, is what it means to be an American, is, the people caring about the Constitution and adhering to an originalist interpretation of it, and believing in the Bill of Rights and all this stuff, like, is that going to be preserved if we have open
Right.
borders and all these people coming here and
Well,
whatnot, especially as we're, it's not just like we opened the borders and then see what happens. It does seem, even to me, that both intentionally and unintentionally, the state is sort of ramping up that process, right? Like, it's not totally just like a free market, like millions of people just decided at once to, like, come here. A lot of them are sadly refugees, and either from war torn countries or countries where, there's been complete political destabilization and whatnot. And I strongly hate the dehumanization of a lot of these people, and this sort of like the, kind of like a, blanket, like, like, yeah, there are some gang members and some criminals and whatnot in that
yeah.
calculus, but people tend to play, especially, ICE and the law enforcement right now are playing rather fast and loose with, actually, they're not even
Yeah.
playing fast and loose with making the determinations. They're just not making determinations because they said, well, due process, what's that, right? So,
Right, right, right.
uh,
Well,
yeah,
that's the irony, right? They're going to come here and they're going to change our values, and they're not going to believe in the
right, yeah,
Constitution. So let's throw away the Constitution.
right. No, the irony is not lost on me,
Right.
which is why
Yeah, yeah,
I'm
yeah,
like I'm
yeah.
simultaneously raging against both sides, because I'm
Right.
just like,
It
it's like that Family Guy meme where it's like, kids,
right.
you're both
Well,
awful.
or I thought of the Muhammad Ali thing about, he wasn't going to go fight the Viet Cong because the Viet Cong never called him the N word. It's like, Mexican never tried to take away my freedom. You do. And so, um,
Right.
yeah, I mean, I will say that there is something different going on in Europe, because Europe really is a welfare state. And I think when you look at, this history of immigration, when people say we're a nation of immigrants, um, and the melting pot, there's really something to that. And we don't think about it much because we focus kind of more on the first generation, people who come here maybe don't speak great English or whatever, and we kind of ignored the fact that we're all mutts, right? And so, I think we have this sort of history of people coming here and getting it, and getting the American dream and understanding it, and having to stand up on their own 2 feet, which means they have to get along with their neighbors, they have to work in their communities where they live. And I think what Europe allows is, this kind of ghettoization, where you can sort of come here and just take money and never really become integrated into society in any meaningful way. And so, yeah, I think there are some real dangers in Europe. And as far as like the voting thing, like, obviously as anarchists and libertarians, we would sort of say, yeah, well, maybe you shouldn't let people's freedom be decided by votes. And that's part one. But then also, like, too, like, this is like always, like, just kind of amazed me a little bit when people on the right are like saying, oh, they're trying to sneak Mexicans over here and immigrants so they can because they'll vote for them. It's like, well, why will they vote for them? It's like, well, because they don't, they're not racist. And it's like, well, a lot of these people from Cuba are conservative. A lot of people coming from, like, sort of more like Muslim countries even
Oh yeah,
are
no, there
tend
was
to
a
be
big
very
there was a big turnout of Hispanics and Puerto
right
Ricans and other, yeah, for Trump.
for Trump.
So
Right,
it,
and
yeah,
he
yeah,
was, and that amazed me because, I mean, he was pretty hardcore. Like I
yeah.
felt like if anybody's not going to vote for this guy, it's got to be like Hispanics, right? And but
Similar Stockholm
I think a
syndrome
lot,
going on there.
yeah. Well, I've got a few friends who are kind of, second, third generation immigrants, and they're very anti illegals, right? They sort of have a sense of, like, I got in here the right way, or my grandparents did, or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, so but yeah, I mean, to me, like, the right is telling on themselves a little bit, like when they say, like, there's all these people who come in who have these conservative values who should be voting for us, but they're not. They're voting for the other party. Well, why is that? you know, like,
It's
these are people
because
who
they're
are like,
not white, Cody. No, I mean, but like, literally, there's people saying that, and I'm just like, I don't know. Again, and we should wrap up here, but like, it's like I feel like I'm getting punked. I'm like, because I've for years been saying, I'm a '90s kid. I was like, we racism's a thing of the past, and then it's just
Mhm.
like, then all of a sudden it's just like, the right wing said, hold my beer. You think racism is the thing of the past? Like, that's
Right.
why I'm toying around making the title of this episode provocatively, like making racism great again. Like
Oh wow.
that almost seems to be what the
Well,
theme is lately. But
yeah.
Cody, so I want to give
Well,
you we're short on time. I'm going to give you the last word here, just to kind of like land us and give us your final kind of take on just like what you think the like as libertarians, as Christians, how do we stay grounded as we're continuing to kind of like unpack and dissect all these
yeah.
different threads and trying not to get too lost in the craziness. Try to make it as simple as you can for us, right?
Yeah. One of the things we thought we were maybe going to talk about tonight, but we've run out of time a little bit, is the Shiloh Hendricks thing. The
Right.
lady at the
Yeah.
park who was screaming the N-word at a child and was able to crowdfund all this money from supporters. And you know, I don't think we can leverage that as libertarians. I I think I think that libertarianism is actually opposed to that kind of thing. And in particular, when I say that kind of thing, I mean identity politics. And what
Yes.
the Shiloh Hendricks thing tells me, and this is not long after there was another situation where a black kid stabbed a white kid, and then his family crowdfunded from other people, probably not the same people I would imagine, who crowdfunded Shiloh Hendricks. But what that tells me is that we're in a time right now where I think identity politics has largely replaced whatever principles and policy were part of the left and right traditionally, right? And what I would say is we should not be doing that. Like to me, libertarianism is kind of this third way that's not really concerned about identity politics. We're concerned about individuals, and we're concerned. I mean,
Well, I think we're
libertarianism.
concerned insofar as we should be actively against
Well, but yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I
identity.
mean to
Yeah.
say that's not shouldn't be part of our wiring to think in those terms.
Yes.
Like
Yes, I agree.
libertarianism is kind of universalistic, and it's also kind of individualistic, but it's not really as collectivistic.
Right.
That's that kind of identity politics stuff you get on the left and the right, and,
Yep.
and I don't think we should play into that. I think we should present ourselves as an alternative and say, "Aren't you sick of this? Like, is this? I mean, is this how you want to do this? Is this how you want to live? Is this, do you want to spend every day angry that that somewhere 12 states over there might be a drag queen story hour? Like, just I would like to think that we can actually present a meaningful alternative to people, and maybe that means if you still want to join an Amish community because that's just where your values are or whatever. Okay, fine, sure, but like I'm just if you're sick of identity politics like I am, I think what you do is you look at libertarianism, you think it through, you take the ideas seriously, and you apply them. Um,
Yeah.
that's
And
I
and
don't know. That's
and
that's
and
that's
then and
maybe the
then
best
after
way
that,
to
you
do
go
it.
to libertarianchristians.com/donate. You make sure you're subscribed to the Biblical Anarchy podcast, to Libertarian Christians podcast, to all our podcasts. And yeah, no, I mean, but like in all seriousness, I do hope that even conversations like this are part of showing people that there's a better way. That like
Yeah,
we can meet people where they're at and go, listen, I get it. The world can be scary. There's things going on that are outside of your control, but especially as Christians, right? We can talk about libertarian politics, but especially as Christians, like if you read the entire Bible and you come away thinking that like what Christ really wants you to do is to go create, a giant white ethno state. I would encourage you to like I don't know what translation you're using, but find a better translation and reread it and come back to me. Uh, Cody,
it's that
thanks
it's that,
for
it's that, it's that Trump Bible, Jacob.
oh gosh, yeah. Oh, my pastor as a joke got me one of those Founders Bibles.
Oh,
Um,
cool.
Cody, I appreciate you coming on. It's a blast as always. We'll have to do it again sometime. And everyone can, people can of course follow you at the Libertarian Christians podcast because you co-host there. What's your handle again on X and social media? People can find you on Facebook and
Yeah.
Instagram and all that.
Yeah, so if you're watching it, I copied you and I put my Twitter handle in my little name there. So it's at Cantus Firmus CC CANTUS FIRMUS CC. So you can find me there on Twitter.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in and listening. Yeah, as I always conclude by saying, live at peace, live for Christ. Take care. Talk to you next time.